English. If it's not okay, then
either
I go or you go. Okay, so I'm going to start today by talking about one particular learning community that we've been studying for many years now, and tell you a little bit of, first of all, the research setting, what we've been studying, because my presentation, the end of my presentation, and two other presentations are going to be discussing the same research setting. So you have to pay very close attention to me if you want to understand the other top speakers. And I'll tell you at the very end a little bit. I don't have a chance to talk about all the research, but just I'll summarize a little bit of the research that I've done on this learning community, and other people will summarize some of the research that's still ongoing. So this particular learning community occurs in the Educational Technologies program at the University of Haifa. And in this program, we have graduate students in a master's program. They're coming from various fields in education. Many of them are teachers, some of them are curriculum developers, some of them are school administrators, some of them work in different institutions that deal with education. Everyone is interested in education, and for all of them, we do a form of professional development. Hachshava Anshe Chinuch, teachers and others, to get them to think about learning in deeper ways, learning in the 21st century, learning in the information age. And so, of course, we want them to know, just like Danny has said, about learning communities. And lechen, therefore, we study the field, the discipline of the learning sciences in many of the different courses in this program. And in this particular research that some of us are going to be talking about, we're looking at just the introductory course to this program. All students, there's about 15 or 20 students, depending on the year, take this one particular course to introduce them to the field. It's a wiki-based course, as Danny has talked about, a wiki-based learning community, and wanted to see, well, what happens there in this learning community. So first, I want to tell you a little bit about this learning community. There's many names for it. Technically, it's called Sugiyot V'Gishot B'Lemidah V'Hora'ah B'Sugiyot Atilot Technologia, or in English, Challenges and Approaches in Technology and Learning and Teaching. But everyone seems to just call it Sugiyot, so I think that's the best thing that we should just call it here. And there's a relationship here. This, of course, is a blended course, meaning once a week, the group comes together and meets face-to-face for 4 hours. They go and they discuss. I'll explain what they do during this once-a-week meeting. And then throughout the week, they work very, very intensively, collaborating in a wiki-based environment. Okay? And then they go back and forth over the course of 13 weeks, learning and challenging themselves and growing together. And I like to describe it as a bridge over troubled water. I think many of you know the song, the famous Simon and Garfunkel song, and I'll explain why. By the way, if you see the water moving, you're not seeing things. It really is moving. I worked very hard on that. Well, I want to start on the side over here. I told you the students study the learning sciences. And so, for example, they'll study things like learning communities. They'll study collaboration. They'll study the role of technology in this type of learning environments. So that's what they study. That's the content of what they study. On the other side of the bridge, we have a process where the students are engaged in a process of doing these things. So they form a learning community as they come together. They collaborate very, very intensely during the semester. So we have a bridge between the process, or an integration between the process of what they're doing and the content that they're studying. And it's very unique, and it's sort of like learning on steroids. Okay, you're not only learning something, you're doing it. So it's a very, very intense experience. And in order to connect to the process and the content, there is reflective discourse. In other words, students are reflecting on the processes they're going through, and that way they can take these different ideas that they're learning about and they can feel it for themselves. They can truly, deeply understand these concepts. Now, when we have a situation like this, there's a lot of challenges that come up, and therefore the name of the course is Challenges or Sugiyot. Some of the challenges that come up are these interpersonal challenges. As an example, you have teachers or students who are used to coming to a program or to a classroom and having the teacher give them some sort of lecture and then trying to, to regurgitate the information or learn the information that the teacher tells them. But here they have to go and suddenly build knowledge in a wiki-based environment. So they have to go and argue and negotiate different ideas with one another. They have to link to different concepts. And so therefore, this causes them a lot of interpersonal challenges that are epistemologic. Where does knowledge come from? Who creates knowledge? And for many people, this can be a very, very deep challenge. On the other hand, they also have to work together intensely, collaboratively. They really need to get to know each other. They need to work with the different personalities. There's a lot of social challenges, even emotional challenges that come up with working together. So there's also a number of interpersonal challenges that come up. So the combination of these makes this type of water here, the troubled water. And this is the sort of discussion which helps us to make the bridge between the process the students are going through and connect it to the different ideas of the learning sciences. What is learning altogether? Okay? I know that's quite abstract and it's a little bit hard to understand. I'll try to make it a little more structured to explain how the course works and show you these three different content, process, and reflection, where it shows up, how it's done. This is an actual 3-week snapshot of this learning community, week 4, week 5, and week 6. And you can see during week 4 up on top, there's a face-to-face meeting for 4 hours. And then after that, it's followed by an online meeting on the wiki for the whole week. And then again, it goes back to face-to-face meeting, and then online and face-to-face. And it continues like this, as I said, for 13 or 14 weeks. And so don't quote me on this because it's a little bit of a rough sketch. But here you have what you have in the green. Of course, this is where the students are engaged in a process of this is where the students study particular content. Of course, it occurs in other areas. But for example, they'll read a chapter in an article, or they'll watch a lecture. They'll engage in the content of the learning sciences. Here, what you have in red is where they engage in a process of building knowledge together, of collaborating deeply. And then over here in in blue, is where they reflect on both of these things happening. Now, these things all happen together. I'm sort of simplifying a little bit, but you can see that the whole course is designed around these 3 big processes: studying content, being engaged deeply in a process of learning together, and reflecting on these 2 things at the same time. So what's the big idea of many professional development? What's unique? I promised you here a theoretical framework, a way to think about what's happening here. So when we do professional development, or הכשרת אנשי חינוך, okay, then the basic model in many successful programs works something like this. You elicit teachers' prior knowledge about teaching or about education. What do they know about education? Okay. Then teachers understand content about what's able people learn, pedagogy, and then they could transfer that into their own practices. For example, if they're a teacher, they can go into their classroom and they can develop their pedagogies. But we do something a little bit different. We put an emphasis in a different place. Okay? The emphasis on what I just explained is over here. It's called there and then discourse. In other words, a teacher, let's just say we have a group of teachers that come together into a classroom. Okay, what are the teachers going to talk about? They're going to teach about, in many good educational programs, they're going to talk about their own practices as teachers. So a teacher will come in and they'll say, yes, they'll probably do some sort of reflection. They'll say, yes, yesterday when I taught my math lesson, I did this and this. So they're talking about what happened there in their classroom, and then maybe yesterday or this morning or whatever it is. And oftentimes that's the basis of discussions, and that's how they grow and they build. That's a wonderful model, very, very successful in many cases. But we emphasize something a little bit different. We put an emphasis on the here and now. Okay? And this is the process of what I'm talking about. So the students come in, and instead of talking about what they do in their classrooms, they're building a learning community together. They're collaborating very deeply together. And we talk about what's going on here between ourselves as a group. Okay? And so we have very intense experience together as learners, and then we go and try to understand how we learn together. So it changes the model from the previous one. The second and the third parts stay the same, but the first one changes. Instead of going and thinking about how they teach or what their knowledge is about teaching, they focus on how they learn here. And then by, on their own flesh and blood, understanding more deeply their identities as learners, then they can go and understand content about how people learn better, and this can get translated into their own teaching or educational practices. Okay, so a theoretical framework that has come about from this work, just one of them. I apologize, I don't have time to go in 10 minutes to tell you, share with you data, and share with you how we reached some of these conclusions, but I can explain to you one of the ways how people's practices change when they enter into these learning communities. Okay? So the question I asked in my research was, when someone enters into one of this particular learning community, how does a person change? Okay? How does a person develop? Okay? And so the first part has to do with students learning about their own practices, their own learning in participatory practices in this learning community. Okay, so who am I as a learner? How do I collaborate with others? How do I build knowledge? And so what happens is people in the learning community, they start to develop practices in the learning community is different than a traditional setting, where in a traditional educational setting, a teacher might be talking and the students listening, and the students don't really have an opportunity to express themselves. And when I say express themselves, I mean fully. Not just to express their thoughts and ideas, but really to show who they are. Really to allow their deep beliefs, their deep values to come out in the learning community. But in our learning community, that's something we do allow to do. We encourage the students to express themselves fully. And over time, the practices that they come in with are expressed inside the learning community. And so that's the first very important aspect, dimension of a learning community, is that students can really bring themselves out into the learning community. So they can really show themselves. Okay, so for example, a student who may be very competitive with other students, or a student who likes to learn from the instructor but doesn't like to share their knowledge with their peers, okay, in their own lives, given some time, that's the same type of thing that's going to happen inside the learning community. But then what happens, and that's what we talked about, the process, that's what I talked about, the process of their learning. These are some of the things that occur in the when they're learning together and they have a chance to reflect on it so they can see these things. And then they do reflect on it, and they realize that some of these practices they're quite happy with. People sometimes are very good at collaborating, they get very nice feedback from their peers, and they're quite happy with themselves and the way they're working together. But sometimes there might be parts, people are quite complicated, there might be parts of their own practices which they're dissatisfied with for many different reasons. And sometimes they're just curious, they want to learn new things, they want to grow, they want to develop. Sometimes they get feedback from the other community members that the way they're behaving isn't good. It's not working for the other people in the community. I think Jackie will talk a little bit about that in her presentation on norms. Okay? So students have some dissatisfaction with their own practices, and they're dissatisfied with some things they want to change. It gives them a motivation to change. And then they can go and they can make a change. Once they've reflected on and understood what they don't like, what they are unhappy with, then they can try to go and make a change. And it's not an easy process, and it's not necessarily a linear process. They can go back and forth, they can regress, it's quite complicated, it's embedded in their lives, it's not something quite easy to change, but here's 3 dimensions to change that we've discovered, how people change when they enter into these learning communities. And the changes that people make are not changes, small changes of learning a piece of knowledge, but this is a change of a way a person is. Okay? People change lifelong practices that they have. In some cases, we have students who might be 50 years old and have a lifetime, many years of having established certain practices, having successful careers, and after 50 years of their lives, they say, wait a minute, now I understand how I can start changing, because I can start working and learning together and thinking about how knowledge is created differently. And now that's the theoretical framework. But what are the pedagogical implications of this? What does that mean for the way that we need to teach when we create a learning community? So if we take the same 3 dimensions that just talked about in the theoretical framework, then there's different implications in the way that we teach. I talked about the full expression of teachers. Actually, I mean full expression of learners, because it's not just teachers. Anyone who's their learner needs to express their own practices and encouraged to do so. The process and content integration, so they can understand the processes they're going through and connect them to the content they're learning. The technology, which is designed not just to share knowledge, but also to build relationships with one another, to develop a sense of intimacy so people can get to know one another, okay? And also for them to learn how to learn together. And the here and now discourse, so students can talk about themselves and talk about their own group when they're learning together. The second dimension, of course, students need to reflect on themselves and say, what are my practices, to give each other feedback about their own practices. And in the final dimension, there's this idea of the laboratory metaphor, that the learning community is somewhat of a laboratory. People can try out new practices. They need to feel very safe to go and to try different ways of learning together so they can make a change. Because making a change can be, a deep change can be quite difficult for people to do. And of course, it needs to be guided. It's not enough just to be told to change, but you need to take small steps and inspire. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.